Hello everyone, it's Eric, and you saw the title. I'm talking about who I think won every single epic rap battle of history. There are 86 battles, so I'm going to keep this fairly short in terms of the description of why each person won, and subscribe to the channel so you know when new rap battles and other rankings and other content come out. With all that out of the way, let's begin. Going in chronological order, first is John Lennon vs. Bill O'Reilly. This is my least favorite ERB, so neither's very good, but I will give Bill O'Reilly this one. I think his final bit was funny enough, and the Yellow Submarine line was okay, whereas John Lennon had pretty much nothing. Now, Darth Vader vs. Adolf Hitler won. I would give this one to Darth Vader. His bit about who even knows if I'm your father is the funniest bit in the battle, and it's gonna give it a slight edge. Abe Lincoln vs. Chuck Norris, I give this one to Abe Lincoln, no doubt. I do think the verbal John Wilkes Booth line from Chuck is good, but Abe Lincoln has far superior stuff, and it's quite humorous the whole way through. So Abe Lincoln is pretty solid and won fairly easily. Now for Sarah Palin vs. Lady Gaga, neither is great here, but I at least think the governor of Alaska that's like a principal of a homeschool line is the best in the battle, so Lady Gaga gets the win, but it's not really because it was an amazing role or anything like that. Now for Kim Jong-il versus Hulk Hogan and Macho Man, I give this one to the wrestlers easily. They had some quite funny lines, such as the Beijing bit, the spend less time rapping and start feeding your people, punk. Kim Jong-il did not have a lot of funny stuff, so I definitely give this one to the wrestlers. Now for Bieber vs. Beethoven, I think no one will be surprised to hear that I think Bieber won. Okay, actually no, Beethoven won this for sure. Beethoven had some awesome lines, his final verse had a genuinely insane closer, and Bieber was not great. Now for Albert Einstein vs. Stephen Hawking, I find this one less balanced than I once did, where Stephen Hawking definitely won. The auto-tune works quite well, and some of his lines sound and are awesome. I think the bit about the calculator at the end is great, the 10 million bit will always be funny, definitely a win for Hawking. Genghis Khan versus the Easter Bunny. This one no doubt goes to Genghis Khan, who was fairly fun, and had a few solid lines in there. I at least like him bragging about how he was able to get his DNA all around the world, and it's fairly fun. Easter Bunny definitely had some of the worst lines in the series. Now for Bonaparte versus Dynamite. This one I'm going to give to Napoleon. Now for Ben Franklin versus Billy Mays, I give this to, even with the ShamWow guy being there, Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin has some pretty solid lines in there. Call me Arthur Miller because his death of a salesman is a very awesome line, and there wasn't a whole lot of substance for Billy Mays. ShamWow guy did come in with some great stuff, but it was not quite enough to beat out the very solid Ben Franklin. Now Gandalf versus Dumbledore, both are bad, but I do at least think the prophecy line is solid enough on the Dumbledore side that I will give Albus the win. Now for Shakespeare versus Seuss, if I can do solely individual verses here, Cat in the Hat is my favorite verse. There's a lot of great references to Dr. Seuss in there, and some pretty solid flow, and the funny thing about Shakespeare's work having to be translated on the opposite page, which is very true. That said, for an overall battle, things bring it down enough, and Shakespeare was strong enough, that I will be giving William Shakespeare the win. Now Mr. T vs. Mr. Rogers, this one is going to Mr. Rogers for some hilarious bits, particularly in that final verse. While Mr. T did have that A-Team reference that was quite funny, I feel that Mr. Rogers was definitely the superior in this battle. Now for Chris Columbus vs. Captain Kirk, I believe it's unpopular to say that Captain Kirk won, but I do think it's the case. I feel like Christopher Columbus was alright, I at least like his Wrath of Khan bit, but the rest of it, while the performance is funny, he doesn't have a lot of great lines, whereas Captain Kirk was able to diss things about how the New World was already inhabited, Christopher Columbus never made it to India, things like that. And the performance does not get in the way for me. In fact, I think it's a great part of the battle. Now for the first Nice Peter vs. Epic Lloyd, I don't care who won this one that much. It's two guys who were just kind of doing a bit to get ready for the next season. It's funny enough, and I guess I'll give Nice Peter the win, as I like his Chuck Norris line a lot, but this one's not really one where anyone should be upset over who won. Now for Season 2, the second Vader vs. Hitler battle, no doubt Hitler won this one. I will not say that in any other context. Now for Master Chief vs. Leonidas, while I do think Leonidas had the very funny 6-year-old son bit, I'll be giving Master Chief the win no doubt, for some pretty awesome flows and lines, and a great performance of course. Now for a very one-sided one, Wright Bros vs. Mario Bros. Wright Bros destroyed here. Their verses sound amazing, and they had quite a few fun lines. On the other hand, Mario Bros, they have a few funny things like if you want to fly, eat the leaf, but they're not very good. Now on the other hand, this next battle I consider the closest ERB. Michael Jackson vs Elvis Presley. Very hard to choose for me, where I feel both have absolutely ruthless lines. On the Michael Jackson side, you're dissing Elvis's death, and then on the Elvis side, you're dissing the fact that Michael Jackson almost dropped his son off a balcony, and that his dad forced him to keep making good music so he could get money, and it was crazy. This battle is one of their best. I will give the edge to Michael Jackson for being just a bit more consistent, but this one, it could really go either way. Cleopatra vs Marilyn Monroe. I guess I'll give to Cleopatra for having two very strong disses, though I do still think the Marilyn Monroe performance is probably the superior in the battle. Now for Steve Jobs vs Bill Gates, my favorite ERB, it's one where it's hard to choose a winner between the main two, but I do think HAL 9000's verse is awesome enough that I will be giving HAL 9000 the win here. With some awesome flows, really cool style of editing, and just a lot of memorable lines. I definitely think HAL 9000 is the highlight of the battle for me. Now Frank Sinatra vs Freddie Mercury. It seems weird to say Freddie Mercury won because admittedly a lot of the stuff I love is how bizarre the humor is in the verse, but it's really, really funny. Frank Sinatra does have a few alright lines in there, and he's good, but the battle was clearly more focused on making Freddie Mercury the grand personality he is. And I'll be giving him the win, but it's definitely a kind of weird battle to talk about in general. Now for Barack Obama versus Mitt Romney, I think Obama definitely won out of the main two, but Abe Lincoln had strong enough legit disses against the main two candidates that I will be giving Abe Lincoln the win, mainly for his thing about "I fought what was on my brain until a bullet went through it," which is a very hardcore line. And the eagle bit is always enjoyable. Now Doc Brown vs Doctor Who, there was a bigger focus on Back to the Future references here, but I will be giving Doctor Who the win here, just because there wasn't a lot of great disses and wins for Doc Brown. Bruce Lee vs Clint Eastwood. Bruce Lee was good in here, not bad at all, but Clint Eastwood went in on being very offensive, and while I can understand why that would deter some viewers, I think it works well and does allow him to win the battle, and his final line is of course a fairly brutal closer. Batman vs Sherlock Holmes. I will give to Sherlock Holmes, though I do think Robin's bit is the highlight of the battle, but Batman definitely holds it back enough that, yeah, it's not going to be a win for him. Moses vs Santa Claus. Both have one bit each that I think is really awesome for very different reasons. For Santa Claus, I think his thing about "I'm from the North Pole, that's why my rhymes are so cold," is such a funny line and how it's delivered, even though it lacks substance, and that's my favorite part of him in the battle. But I'll be giving Moses the win for the really awesome flow that was something like, "You need to stop breaking into houses and creeping and peeping on naughty kids while they sleep in and keep your hands off my stocking." That's a great flow right there. That part was awesome. And I love the "Let My Little People Go" bit, so even though Snoop Dogg had a few flow inconsistencies, I will be giving him the win. Now Adam vs Eve, both are terrible. It feels wrong to choose a winner, but to be fair, Adam had the one good line in the battle about "Did I give up a rib for this?" So I guess technically he won, but no one wins by watching this battle. Now MLK vs Gandhi, both have some insane stuff. This has some of the best writing of any ERB, but Gandhi going in with stuff like "Boycott those grits, sit in with some spinach, leave your thoughts on the door like the real Martin Luther," and quite a bit more. I do think Gandhi edged out. Now Tesla vs Edison, I don't love how Tesla was kind of written to automatically win this one, but I still genuinely feel like Edison had better stuff. I love his thing about how the battle would be without him. "I'll bet you $50,000 you'll never forget it" really embraces that eccentric and somewhat scummy energy Edison had, and even though it was trying to make him the villain, I still feel Edison won this battle. Now for Babe Ruth vs Lance Armstrong, an easy win for Babe Ruth. Lance Armstrong was fire, no doubt. A lot of great lines in there, I love his closing flow, but Babe Ruth has some of the best, if not the very best, of writing an ERB. His closer is the best in the series, no doubt. His entire second verse is crazy. This is definitely a Babe Ruth win. Mozart vs Skrillex. Unlike with Bieber vs Beethoven, everyone's mentioned before that Skrillex did put up a good fight, and Skrillex had some strong lines, though I do feel his main diss got repetitive with the whole daddy issue thing, and Mozart was funnier with some stronger stuff overall. I've always loved the piano to fortissimo bit, which for those who do not know means soft to very, very loud. So Mozart does take the win. Now for the final Season 2 battle, Rasputin vs. Stalin. All 5 Russians were quite different, but I give Gorbachev the win for being my favorite of them. I think Lenin probably had the most intense verse, but Gorbachev was funny. The bravado he brought was quite humorous, and lines like, shook hands with both Ronalds, Reagan and McDonald's, no doubt if your name ends with in, time to get out. I love that verse. Definitely my favorite. Season 3. For the final Vader-Hitler battle, Vader destroyed. I felt that Hitler was given a very poor verse, whereas Vader was given the very awesome fired up flow, and Boba Fett comes in with the unbelievably funny Boba Tea line. That is one of the funniest of those vulgar type lines in the entire series. Now Blackbeard vs. Al Capone. Contrary to what others have said, I kind of feel like Blackbeard had superior rhyme schemes and flow. I love Be With Me Please and the High Seas Caesar, my cold heart is many degrees beneath the deep freezer. That's great. Though I do think Al Capone won for some better disses, and the performance being a bit better, not to mention Blackbeard getting a little repetitive with the actual content of his great schemes and flow. Now for Miley Cyrus vs. Joan of Arc, I guess Joan of Arc did win this, but neither really had a lot of great stuff. Not much to say here. Bob Ross vs. Pablo Picasso. I think Bob Ross was able to pull off some pretty great disses and an awesome flow, and while Picasso was fine as well, I do think Bob Ross takes the win, but there's not as much to talk about with this one. Now for Michael Jordan vs. Muhammad Ali. Both have a lot of great disses, awesome battle. I think most would say Ali won, and I can understand that. Ali had great bits like the Nike shoe bit, but I feel like the comeback that Jordan was able to come with the whole thing about Ali being just as much of a sellout, if not worse, not to mention a great first verse with unbelievable lines. Right from Dodge the Battle like he did Vietnam, that is a great verse, the whole thing is awesome. I've always thought Michael Jordan won, and for now, I stand by that. Now for the Trump vs. Scrooge battle, it's kind of hard to pick a winner here, because they're not trying to win a battle, but I think my favorite is probably JP Morgan, a very eccentric and fun verse, so that's good. Now for Rick Grimes vs. Walter White, neither is very good, neither seems to want to win a battle, but I guess the better stuff seems to come from Walter White, so I'll give it to him. Now Goku vs. Superman, a very fun one to talk about. Everyone says Goku won for that closer, but I'm sorry, Superman won here, no doubt for me. I feel like right from the beginning, he has such a great energy and performance, far superior flow, the whole scheme with the greasy slick MC from DC, and of course he has the hilarious delivery of the haha, your rapping is weaker than your fight scenes. I know he didn't have the one great diss that overshadows the thing about Christopher Reeve, but I'm sorry, Superman was far more enjoyable for me, and I've always thought he won the battle. Now for Edgar Allan Poe vs. Stephen King, it's easy to pick Stephen King here. With a great first verse, and really fun stuff about how he fully embraces the fact that he makes a lot of money even if his work isn't always the best. His flow is amazing in that first verse, and even with a Watsky second verse, I don't think Poe was able to win. Now for Isaac Newton vs. Bill Nye. Even with Tyson coming in, there is no doubt that Isaac Newton won. His arrogance really does carry through the whole battle, but he still pulls off some of the amazing lines, some of the best in the entire series. I've always loved every reaction as an equal and opposite reaction except when we both start rapping. That's one of the best. The thing about Shadow of the Mind is wonderful. The fact that they're able to pull off a sort of limerick at the end with a weird calculus equation. Isaac Newton was amazing. Probably my favorite rapper in the entire series. Underrated. And definitely beat Bill Nye. George Washington vs. William Wallace. Washington didn't pull off a whole lot of great lines, honestly, whereas Wallace came in for blood. And he did this sort of thing like Tesla, where it's like, hey, you were actually evil, you were not as good as people say. And it's not great that that's the main focus, I guess, but it makes more sense for this character than a certain one I could talk about. But either way, Wallace won. Moving on. Now for the final Season 3, Artists vs. Turtles. Artists win. Their first verse is awesome. Turtles aren't as bad as some say, but I think the Artists definitely won. Starting Season 4, Ghostbusters vs. Mythbusters. Because of that awesome first verse from the Mythbusters, with some incredible flows, scientifically accurate stuff about positrons, and a great harmony going through it, I'm definitely going to say the Mythbusters took the battle. For Romeo and Juliet vs. Bonnie and Clyde, Juliet did provide some very strong disses, though I've never felt she was nearly as insane as people have said. She still won the battle, Romeo and Juliet did take it, but it's not really the insane one-sided thing so many have said. Zeus vs. Thor, an easy win for Thor. Zeus had 2 or 3 strong disses, and Thor, right out the gate, took it. And I've always loved, I'll drop you like Greece's GDP, and there's so many strong lines from Thor. Definitely took that one. Jack the Ripper vs. Hannibal Lecter. It is well known at this point that Jack the Ripper didn't really diss in his first verse. It was all puffing himself up, and while his stuff is great, Hannibal Lecter was able to win by focusing more on dissing his opponents while still having that great arrogance to him. For Ellen vs. Oprah, easy, Oprah. Oprah had better performance, better lines, better flow. Oprah takes this one, no doubt. Directors. Directors is a weird one because my pick is Michael Bay. I know Michael Bay didn't have particularly strong disses or clever wordplay or anything like that, but I have loved that verse ever since I first saw it. It's a really funny one. It's probably one of the funniest verses in the entire series, one of my favorites in the entire series. So even though Hitchcock and Tarantino had stronger disses and wordplay and all that, I cannot pick anyone else besides Michael Bay for this one. Now, Lewis and Clark vs. Bill and Ted. That one, I think both were strong. Bill and Ted had the best line about Meriwether Lewis offing himself, but I think Lewis and Clark won overall for some stronger lines, and I think their verses sounded slightly better, but I can definitely understand you going either way with this one. Now, David Copperfield vs. Harry Houdini, a very easy win for Copperfield. Houdini had very poor flow for most of it, honestly. His lines were not great. The fact that his big diss in the whole battle, basically, is "you're the worst thing that happened to magic since the gathering," that's dumb. Whereas Copperfield was able to bring in some much better stuff. I like the flow for the grand illusion that your party tricks are relevance. His fast stuff works very well, and the heart monitor beat is much more intense on his side, showing that he had more intense stuff. For RoboCop vs. the Terminator, I'll give it to Terminator. He had some stronger rhyme schemes and flow. I love that part where he goes really intense in his first verse, and he had some more disses. Even if his closer stuff is a little obvious, I do think he won. For Philosophers, it is a interesting one to try to pick a winner because at a certain point, the best stuff is happening after they're turned against each other. Though I think, mainly for the parts where they're actually rapping against each other, I give Eastern the win for having the very strong Confucius fast flow part. I like that one a lot. Shaka Zulu vs. Julius Caesar. No doubt Julius Caesar won. Even though it's very funny that he referred to Shaka's verse as a cipher, besides that, he was able to bring some awesome lines. The part where he fully describes how he will defeat Shaka's main strategy that seemed unbeatable, and his final line, that's great. Definitely took it there. Jim Henson vs. Stan Lee. Both of them were fine, but Walt Disney, even though he wasn't going with disses against them necessarily, kinda had a Michael Bay type thing, where I love his verse, not for being fun though, more for being somewhat scary, and having some great lines that fully embrace the greediness and arrogance that came with Walt Disney and the company today. For Boba Fett vs. Deadpool, I'll be saying Boba Fett took this one, even though some of his best lines are a little more blatant and less clever per se than I initially thought. I've always loved the thing about Deathstroke ripoff and such like that. Deadpool was good too, but Boba Fett does take this one. For Season 5, J.R.R. Tolkien vs. George R.R. Martin. Tolkien no doubt won this. Right from You're Under 50 Shades of Grey, it was already over. I love his stuff. For Gordon Ramsay vs. Julia Child, I think Child is the favorite. Most say that she won, but I've always preferred Gordon Ramsay's stuff, even though both were great. I just feel that even though Ramsay was able to diss less, the fact that they fully go in on his great production value and all was very enjoyable, and made his parts better overall. And his final lines about taking a jacket and then giving it back and losing, that was funny. Thomas Jefferson vs. Frederick Douglass. A battle I like more than most. While Jefferson had a phenomenal first verse, I do recognize that he didn't have as much to say in his second verse, and because it was more apology stuff, and Douglas did focus more on getting effective disses, I will be giving Douglas the win. For James Bond vs. Austin Powers, I'll be separating the Bonds, and I think the best in this battle was Daniel Craig. The first James Bond that starts in the battle, his "You Only Live Twice" line is one of the best in all of ERB. And in general, while Austin Powers has that fun energy that a lot of people really enjoy, I don't think his stuff works quite as well for winning the battle. For Bruce versus Bruce, I definitely would say Banner and Hulk were the winner in this one. Far superior lines. Now, moving on to the Great Royale. Alexander the Great versus Ivan the Terrible. Well, everyone here was phenomenal, even Pompey. I think Frederick the Great was the best here. His flow was awesome, he had a ton of great lines. I love the reference to people getting their eyes torn out after building the Kremlin so it can never be recreated. It's extraordinary. His verse is the first one and only one in series history where I pause at the end of it to absorb the awesomeness. Now for Trump versus Clinton, I'll give it to Trump. Lincoln wasn't as strong here, and Clinton had a few fun bits, but I think Trump going fully in on his plan was quite humorous and enjoyable to watch. I think he definitely took this one. Now Ash Ketchum versus Charles Darwin. Ash had the great line about gotta catch 'em all, and he has a few very strong bits in there, but Charles Darwin was amazing. I think his stuff is awesome. I love a lot of the references to his main vocabulary, like the natural selection and all, and his bit with "I'm a masterful naturalist." That's awesome. His closer, I get, is not technically the greatest thing ever, but it's still pretty funny, and he wins. For the Wonder battle, I give it to Stevie Wonder. Wonder Woman was not bad, but T-Pain gave an incredible performance. And the first verse is such a fun one, particularly with the line, "I say DC is a whole step down." And the things about the invisible little jet and all that, I definitely think Stevie was the winner here. For Tony Hawk vs. Wayne Gretzky, I do know Tony had more impressive flow, but Gretzky's flow was fantastic as well, and he had far superior disses in writing. It was pretty much over at that bit that took a super long time for a great payoff about world records, but there's great stuff like "I take a flyer down," and the net worth thing and X Games, and "you got outspun by a 12-year-old kid." This was an easy win for Gretzky. Now Roosevelt vs. Churchill. Pretty much a tie here for me. I know everyone says Roosevelt's better, and yeah, probably, but I can't help it. I love those Churchill verses more than most, and I'm gonna even give the win to him. I've always loved that thing about "I was saving the planet while you were opening recreational sites," national parks in this case for those who have no idea what I'm talking about. I'm kind of going off on a limb with these lyrics here, but Churchill was my favorite in the battle, even though both are amazing. Now for Nice Peter vs. Epic Lloyd 2, I give it to Epic Lloyd, but don't care that much, so moving on. For Season 6, technically, Mark Zuckerberg vs. Elon Musk. Musk is the favorite here, most say that Musk won, but I think Zuckerberg took it. Even though that second verse where Musk had some awesome lines like the MySpace one, and the elf with no friends in charge of human connection, it's all funny, but I would say Musk was not able to beat the first verse from Zuckerberg. I just love that bit about, first of all, Data's Lieutenant Commander, and right from there it was over. That entire verse is just fire. Freddy Krueger vs. Wolverine. Easy win for Wolverine. Where on one side you have "flock of seagulls called," and on the other side you have awesome flow from Wolverine, and a few very strong disses in there. I love Jason Kent talking, he rocks the mic better. Not the strongest line out there, I guess, but it's a funny one, so I definitely would say Wolverine took it. Guy Fawkes vs. Che Guevara. I know Che Guevara had a very nice presentation and flow, but his lines were not good. V for Very Bad Hat is probably one of the worst lines they've ever written. But Guy Fawkes had an insane second verse. All of his lines are good. Muddling the economy, rhyme skills not evenly distributed, Che, and "It's the 5th of November, I'm on fire." I love that. Guy Fawkes took it, no doubt. Now for the fast food battle. Ronald McDonald had a few good lines in there, but I would give it to Burger King. Wendy did not take this one, but there's not too much to say on this one. For the Comedian Royale, George Carlin vs. Richard Pryor. I know Joan Rivers had the strongest disses, and Richard Pryor was quite great too, but I love the performance in that Robin Williams verse, and similar to Michael Bay, even though his lines are not as strong as a lot of the others in the battle, I'd still give him the win. This is one of those that kind of defies the general criteria I go by. Jacques Cousteau vs. Steve Irwin. Cousteau had some good stuff. I love "Contain Yourself Like My Underwater Breathing Apparatus" and the Outback Steakhouse line. But the performance for Steve Irwin and some of the amazing lines. I love the thing about quietly surrendering, and there's a lot of great lines in there. He's just really funny. And there's some awesome schemes in there that sound great, like "If you want to count fish, please take the reef tour, don't go throwing C4 on the seafloor." Seaver win takes this. Now for Sigmund Freud versus Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa is pretty awesome. I like how it builds up to that thing about cocaine for Freud, but right from let's turn to my favorite subject, me, it was over. I think Freud had a lot of other great lines after that, and even though the start of his second verse is insanely weak, he comes back in the end with a few awesome lines. Now for Vlad the Impaler versus Dracula. Dracula was funny, but not very good, unfortunately. Whereas Vlad the Impaler got a few pretty strong disses in there, though I guess it's fairly easy to diss a guy who can die in like 10 different ways. Now for Joker versus Pennywise. This is a tough one, because after the first two verses, I thought Pennywise had it. But by this final verse, I would say Joker took it. The closer for Pennywise is quite weak, and there's some great stuff on that Joker side, like Ask Robin If I Drop Bars, and the Skarsgård pun is insanely clever. But before that, Pennywise puts up a great fight. I've always loved when he's not in your cards, called the Arkham Asylum on Crazy with Bars, and then leading into a few actual disses for Joker, and there's a lot of great stuff in both, but I would definitely give it to Joker now. Thanos vs. Oppenheimer. Of course, everyone first goes to that Fortnite line for Thanos, but you know what? His first two bars are pretty strong, and he has a few good flexes in there, but yeah, Oppenheimer took it, no doubt. Moving on. Now for Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. This battle seemed to give more to Joe Biden, more lines and all, but he had very few actual strong disses, whereas the hunting season stuff, Trump went ham. Trump was unhinged in this, and it was definitely a win for Donald. For Harry Potter vs. Luke Skywalker, this one both have a lot of lines, and both have a lot of fun references. In terms of disses, I would say the Harry Potter side won. Things about Leia and Luke losing his hand, and even the franchise quality. I have to say Harry Potter took this one. Now for Season 7, I think. Not very clear if this is a new season or not, but Ragnar Lodbrok won against Richard the Lionheart. Richard had the good Lion King bit, and I like who's a predominantly fictional MC, dissing the fact that Ragnar had very little real-world impact, but the disses against Richard as a person, and the real trauma that he experienced, mean Ragnar was able to win. Now for Mansa Musa vs. Jeff Bezos, even though Bezos has two incredible lines, I never heard your story and I own Audible, and earning every penny back only took me a month, Mansa Musa was incredible. Right from his opening lines, I love the flow he was able to pull off, Screwface Gene did a great job, and there's far more disses against Jeff Bezos in this than against Mansa Musa. Now for the John battle. All three Johns were good. I'd say Rambo probably was the weakest in terms of content, but I still think the air vent line is great, and no juice was used to make these armies was very good. John Wick was pretty solid, and John McClane was solid as well. Between those two, I think I will give John Wick the edge. I think his schemes were good enough, and they made his lines seem more impressive than they technically actually were, but it seemed like they really were dissing against both. John Wick was definitely quite strong in this, and I'll give Wick the win. And finally, Indiana Jones versus Lara Croft. Lara Croft wins. A lot of strong lines in there, like you tried alien skulls and chose poorly, and even though I think Indy's first verse is great, and his second one has some pretty strong lines, and this battle's pretty good. Lara Croft did have more disses, and they overall worked better. So that's it. Whew. Every ERB, who won and who's next. Well, actually not really who's next, but who won. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. Comment down below your thoughts. Now I need to go get some water. I'll see you next time.